Hey everybody, welcome back to Fighting Matters. I'm Steve Kwan from BJJ Mental Models. I've got my friend Jesse Walker from Rough Hands BJJ. Jesse, how are you doing?
Hey guys, I'm good. Glad to be here.
And today we're digging deep into the world of professional wrestling. Finally, we can get to have this conversation, and this is a chat I have wanted to have for a long time. First, because I like professional wrestling, but also because it's oddly relevant to current events, both inside fight sports, inside politics. And I think most people probably don't understand how relevant professional wrestling has become to the rest of the world today. But the best person to probably talk about that is our friend here, David Wolf. David is a longtime friend of mine, longtime member of the BJJ Mental Models community, but also one of the most knowledgeable professional wrestling experts that I know in terms of the history of the sport, which is why he's here today to maybe help unpack this. But David, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing well, Steve. It's great to be here. Thank you. I feel privileged, and I think what you're doing is great work. And Fighting Matters is probably even more significant, more important than BJJ Mental Models. And I met you through that because it certainly helped me. And yeah, I'm a purple belt at High Style Jiu Jitsu in DC, and yeah, I feel honored to get to speak professional wrestling and Donald Trump with you today.
Well, let's dig into it. I think maybe the first place to start is let's talk about kind of how we got here and how professional wrestling became relevant. I mean, if you look at the state of the world today, you have Donald Trump, who is legitimately a WWE Hall of Famer. And the funny thing is, the WWE often puts celebrities in their Hall of Fame just because they want to kind of throw them a bone. But there's an argument to be made that Donald Trump actually earned that spot as a pro wrestling Hall of Famer. He has made significant contributions to WWE. He has been involved with and promoting all manner of fight sports for decades now. Linda McMahon, right, the wife of Vince McMahon, is the Secretary of Education, which is a farce in and of itself. Pro wrestling, I grew up with this being like a silly, goofy hobby that I used to enjoy, but now it is not this silly thing that grown-ups can just ignore anymore. Very clearly, MAGA and the modern Republican movement has taken significant cues from professional wrestling. But maybe the best place to start is to wind back the clock and talk about how professional wrestling came to be, because that kind of influences the direction that we took here. So, David, I would love to hear you explain, like, what were the roots of professional wrestling, and how did this thing evolve from just being a legitimate catch wrestling sport into what we know it to be today?
So, as we noted earlier in our production meeting, professional wrestling, to me, I question whether it was ever legitimate. Going back to the mid 1800s or whenever, you had it starting to take hold where catch wrestling and when you look at catch wrestling, which is submission wrestling, it comes very close to jujitsu, and jujitsu itself, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, is pretty much an offshoot of pro wrestling. And the history of Brazilian jiu-jitsu in Brazil is littered with the Gracies, taking on professional wrestlers. So at first, professional wrestling, when it was a work, it was a gambling con, which was the idea was to con people out of wagering. They would bet on a certain guy, and the other guy would win. And ultimately, the two wrestlers who were involved in this work, they would split the money. They would often have to leave town, in the cover of darkness because the locals would figure it out. I mean, there were long, long cons. And Frank Gotch, who was probably the most famous of the early professional wrestlers, took took part in a Yukon con where he went up and they he pretended to be this miner for it may have been months. They would, and then they would take all this money and run, literally run. So gambling became a really big issue uh, throughout the United States as far as professional sports goes. In 1918, the Black Sox scandal, which nearly destroyed baseball. Baseball was only saved by Babe Ruth and home runs, a little, and which is there are interesting parallels there too, because baseball, there was a big strike in 1994 in which Barry Bonds, the the home run king. That sort of brought baseball back from the doldrums at that point. But once gambling became an issue in baseball, it also became an issue in wrestling, and wrestling could no longer count on money from, and wrestlers could not earn a living conning the public by having these matches where they would even have matches where, it wasn't based on who would win or lose, but you can find arguments that Ed Lewis was involved in matches that were presumed to be shoots for decades, but now historians question whether they were shoots, and they think Ed Lewis actually was just, involved in a long 6-hour match where the idea was to con the people based on how long the match would take place, and they kept betting that it would end, and it never did. So wrestling had to then evolve once it became a spectator sport. And that's also with the Frank Gotch era. You had to get fans to pay money to watch wrestlers as opposed to bet money on wrestlers. And at that point, it had to become more entertainment. And that's where you had the real con men promoters take over, because in the earlier era, the wrestlers' managers, whoever had the more powerful manager, it determined who would win the match. And then in this next era, it was the power of the promoter. And these promoters were all con men, and they believed, and we've heard the term here on not necessarily Fighting Matters, but on BJJ Mental Models. There's a particular episode I would recommend to everybody, April 1st episode, where we talk about, well, not we, but Steve talks about how professional wrestling serves as perhaps the greatest base for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and this is it's just brilliant. But I don't even know where I was actually.
One of my favorites. I think you were talking about the idea probably of kayfabe, I'm guessing is where you're going with this.
So you had the promoters where they thought they were conning the public into believing that these fake matches were real. And in wrestling, you have all these carny terms. So in wrestling, a shoot is a real match and a work is a fake match. And the idea was you had to kayfabe the public. And really, large portions of public were well aware that wrestling was not on the up and up. Although you had a lot of people who thought, you know what, for the most part, it's not legitimate. But during the Lou Thesz era, Lou Thesz is legitimate. And the truth was, for a long, long time, even after the early era of gambling where you had wrestlers. So the wrestlers who were at the top of wrestling for decades and decades were all legitimate, especially because they had the world championship. And you didn't necessarily have one world champion, but the most important world championship until the era of Hulk Hogan in 1984 was the National Wrestling Alliance, the NWA World Championship. And then the NWA World Champion, right until Ric Flair in the 1980s, had to be able to take care of himself in case there was a double cross. They always feared a double cross because whoever was the world champion was the top wrestler and made the money, and then you could double cross. And there were a history of double crosses. The most famous one was 1997, and people now are like, "What are you talking double crosses?" But it used to matter who won and lost. And Bret Hart in 1997, the Survivor Series, which is now ancient history, it's the most famous screw job of them all, the Montreal screw job. So wrestling,
Every Canadian like myself has grown up to hate Shawn Michaels because of that incident. But basically, a very public screw job where Vince McMahon and Shawn Michaels basically they fucked Bret Hart out of the title. And this I'm sure sounds ridiculous to people because it's all fake, right? But it really, the thing about pro wrestling that's always been most interesting to me is not what happens in the ring. It's the backstage politics behind this. So there was we can spare people the details if they don't know, but basically there was a disagreement between Bret Hart, who was leaving the company, and the company, and their leader, Vince McMahon, who is a very close friend of Donald Trump, actually, a disagreement over how he was going to drop the title. And Bret's big thing was, I'll do it anywhere but Montreal. I don't want to drop it in Canada. And Vince and everyone said, yeah, okay, fine, sure thing. And they had this big match, a title match between him and Shawn Michaels in Canada. But Vince got real paranoid. Like, what if he refuses to drop the title? This might be our only chance. And so mid-match, Vince McMahon called to ring the bell and, award the title to Shawn Michaels instead. And that was not the agreed upon finish. And this was still a time when, although I think the majority of fans were not under any illusion that this was real, I think most people knew. it was not really part of the wrestling culture that we talk about the fact that it's fake. Today, you can, I mean, God, you can listen to Cody Rhodes do interviews talking about his real life. And now, they're doing shows about like how the behind the scenes booking works. No, everyone knows not only is it that it is scripted, but the fact that it is scripted is kind of part of the product, right? The audience comes there and they're supporting the performer as much as they're supporting the fictional character that performer is playing, which leads to weird dynamics where you kind of the line blurs between like, are we criticizing the real person or are we criticizing the character they play? But yeah, all of that is to say that was a very famous incident where the backstage politics bled over into the real world. And to this day, the impact that had on the business was just unbelievable. I mean, we don't need to go into that, but it's a great example of how, man, you describe like this weird political rat fuckery behind the scenes. And if you took out the word wrestler and replaced it with like cabinet secretary, it would sound like you're describing the Trump administration instead of the WWE.
There is also a terrific documentary. It's the only reason we know the facts, what happened here. Because Vince McMahon had one story, Brett had another story, but Brett, by coincidence, had documentarians there who then released a film called Wrestling with Shadows. Excellent, excellent document of just what happened. And you see Brett, what you don't see is Brett knock out Vince McMahon, which is what he does. Because wrestling might not have been real. Brett took it very seriously, took himself, some would say, a little too seriously. Some would say he was a mark for himself. And Brett went back to shower after this had happened and told Vince to leave or he was going to knock him out. And they famously got into a fight and Brett punched him and knocked him out. And you could see in this documentary, you can't see the punch, but you could see Vince wobble on security camera footage as he's being helped out afterwards. So yeah, that's the most famous double cross of them all. But all this is to say, wrestling was a con man business, and Donald Trump is a con man. He's great friends with Vince, and obviously with Linda. Although Vince and Linda are no longer really together, and Vince has his own issues. But Donald Trump, not only we could talk about the legitimacy of Donald Trump being in the WWE Hall of Fame. WWE Hall of Fame is not even a legitimate Hall of Fame. Everyone
It's a show.
It's a marketing tool, and Vince used to pick out whoever would go, and now his son-in-law Triple H does the honor, who he just put
Who's
himself
on the call with us today, apparently, right, Jesse?
He is there. He is. He's undercover as a Jesse Walker, but
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
you
Jesse is
always try to.
constantly told that he
Well,
looks like
thank you.
Triple
I
H.
know how busy you are. I know you have a weekend where you're really trying to sabotage the quote unquote the competition's pay-per-view, but that's a whole other story, and that's also quite related to Donald Trump
It
tax.
is actually, right? Like that kind of political rat fuckery, the dirty tricks that these companies play with each other. It's the exact same playbook that Trump has adopted. And not surprising because Trump is a man who grew up promoting the combat sport. So this is where he learned it from.
And he was involved, heavily involved in at the time, the biggest WrestleMania of that time. It was in 2007. I think it was WrestleMania 23, where Donald Trump put up his hair versus Vince McMahon's hair. And Donald Trump is the babyface. And the match was actually Bobby Lashley against Umaga, who I think he's dead now. But Bobby Lashley was the babyface, and Lashley won, and Vince McMahon's head was shaved. And not
Which
only
was a hell of a look, by the way. Like, to this day, I cannot get used to shaved head Vince, but that probably would have been better than shaved head Donald Trump. So maybe we dodged a bullet there.
Donald Trump goes back in time even further to WrestleMania 4 and WrestleMania 5, which were held in Atlantic City, supposedly in Trump Plaza, but it wasn't actually in Trump Plaza. Again, it was a con. It was in Convention Hall, but it was billed as being in Trump Plaza. So, I mean, WrestleMania 4 is 1988. WrestleMania 5 is 1989. If you go back and you go watch this on Peacock, I don't mean to do free advertising for them, but you go back and you can look and you can see Donald Trump in the front row of these shows. I think it must be Donald Jr. He's there. He's probably having a great time. So Donald was heavily involved in wrestling. He probably learned from it. And it's not just Donald, though. It's like I would always say, Donald Trump is not even the problem of the United States. He's a symptom. Donald Trump, let's say he would have died in that assassination attempt, the problems are still here. They're not changing. He's just a symptom. And politics itself, I mean, politics is a work, and wrestling is a work. Politics, they pretend, maybe they really hate each other in some ways now, but they pretended to hate each other, and behind closed doors they're shaking hands, making deals, cutting deals, right? And then they go in front of the public and trying to, con the public into thinking we're really working hard for you, we're trying, but the other side, they just won't do it, and they're all coming together and they're friends. Less so now, because we have some deep divisions, but politics was always just a work, right? So Donald Trump sees everything as a work. He's just trying to get over, and the public will say whatever. Donald Trump has he has no ideology. I mean, he runs to the right, but he could just as easily run to the left. I always said, if he thought
he used to be a Democrat.
he used to be a Democrat, and if he thought universal health care wouldn't be derided as socialism by some Americans, he would support it. He would support anything that he thinks that he's a populist, right? So all these.
David,
I'm sorry.
Let me ask you something. Do you feel like Trump's time and his kind of fundamental understanding of professional wrestling made him a better politician?
I think it's almost instinctual. I think he was made for wrestling, and I think, I don't know that he learned from Vince McMahon as much as these are birds of a feather, like, coming together. Supposedly, Vince was the only person that he would take calls from during his first term, no matter what. It was Vince. And one funny story, and this is apparently true, and it shows, when people talk about Donald Trump's intelligence or lack thereof,
I know exactly the story.
They had this angle, this crazy angle in 2007 that they had to, and we can get into why 2007, Vince McMahon's limo blew up on Raw, after Raw, in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. I was out. I lived there for a year, so that's how I remember it was Wilkes-Barre. And he supposedly died. And Donald Trump saw this and called because he was worried. It was so clearly just a wrestling angle, but Donald Trump was worried about Vince McMahon's health and safety, and he called to check up on him. So I know Steve indicated he thought he knew the story, and I'm pretty sure by the look on his face that this is the exact story he was thinking of.
Yes, and of course, famously, they had to hit the Control Z or Control Z if you're an American on that story very quickly, because almost right after that, was it a week later, the Chris Benoit murders happened.
Which it was awful time, and horrible. They had to pretend it never happened. Pretend actually both of those things never happened, which is another thing in wrestling, is a big con.
Well, this I want to also bring up and draw some parallels. Just the need to fake everything in pro wrestling. You talked about kayfabing everything. I mean, the example that always comes to mind is it is nearly impossible to get an honest answer out of the WWE as to what their actual attendance figures are. Because they will go up on WrestleMania and they'll say, like, we've got 100,000 people in the building. We broke the record, the all-time record for this building. But then, if you actually dig into like the stadium records, they're over-reporting that by like a massive, massive amount. Presumably they're like counting every like dog, rat, and cockroach in the building as attendees as well. And they've kind of implied that, well, they consider the reporting of the numbers a fact to be part of the entertainment, yes. Right? So even these little things they have to lie about. Everything has to be a performance. And you see the exact same thing with Donald Trump, where the facts are part of the entertainment. They're part of the storyline. And we can talk about alternative facts and how from a political standpoint that is so repugnant and immoral. But I think you bring up a great point, David, which is that from Donald Trump's standpoint, this is just part of the con. It's part of the grift, right? It's part of the story that you tell. You throw out your made-up facts and all of that, and it's just a performance. People who worked with Trump in his first White House had said that he was just notoriously obsessed with ratings. Everything was about ratings, right? And I think you're completely right that he doesn't really have an ideology other than ratings. He will say or do whatever will get him the most attention. And that can change and be fluid on a daily basis. So I think sometimes people, they try to unpack Trump and they try to figure out, like, well, what is his reasoning? What is his reason why? What is his moral justification, or what is his political angle? And really, I think the only angle is he wants the most attention possible, right? I think when he says weird, crazy shit like, I'm going to invade Canada and annex them, I think really it's not part of a strategy. I think it's a trial balloon. I think he's throwing out marketing ideas to see what the public responds to. And we see that, people talk about Trump always chickens out, Trump always backs down. Well, I think that's just because if an idea becomes unpopular, he's going to drop it, right? Much like how in pro wrestling, if someone isn't getting over, if the audience doesn't like them, they're going to stop pushing them and they're going to replace them with someone else. To me, that's the logic behind what Trump does.
You have people en masse kidnapping people off the streets of the United States. So that Trump always backs down. I mean, he's dismantled the federal government quicker than most anyone could have ever imagined. So maybe in his first term, but it's and that's also it's scorched earth type strategy that you also see from not only Vince, who no longer has majority ownership or even that much ownership in WWE, but from TKO that's taken over. And as I think I mentioned earlier in the podcast, this weekend it's not even legitimate competition. AEW is far behind as a number two, and WWE is they are promoting 3 shows on the same weekend, 2 tomorrow and 1 Sunday. So they're undercutting their own shows, each one in order to. I'm not exactly sure what their ultimate goal is. I mean, obviously, is to try to cut into the buys for the AEW pay per view, and you can wonder what it even. The only thing I could see is either pettiness, and there's a lot of personal pettiness going on because they've been making CM Punk pay a personal price for some comments he made back in the day, some quote unquote, let's say, woke comments about WWE's relationship with Saudi Arabia. And, there's personal pettiness or the idea that Tony Khan, by upsetting the salary structure in the industry and making it so wrestlers are actually making what they wrestlers are paid. They're paid $1 million, $2 million, but when it's compared to, let's say, other sports, and people say, well, wrestling's not a sport, they're not earning what they deserve, and they're not unionized, so you can blame them. But ultimately, I think a lot of the issues WWE has with this competition is not that it's competition per se. It's just that it is competition whenever a free agent's available. And Tony Khan, who's part of the Khan family, and they've got a lot of money, and he empties the pocketbooks. And I think actually that's probably at the root of a lot of this, which is, again, it comes down to all WWE exists for today is to make money. And I say that, I mean, if they could make more money, they're going to have a WrestleMania in Saudi Arabia. The Royal Rumble is going there this coming January, and there's going to be a WrestleMania there. And if you had an individual that said, I want WrestleMania in my private home and I'll give you $100 million to do that, that's exactly what they would do because they're just beholden to the shareholders.
And that's, I mean, the topic you're talking about there, that concept is called sport washing, right? Where basically a corrupt country or an evil regime will effectively empty their pocketbooks to try to bring in athletes and sports to promote their own country, to provide a sense of legitimacy. Saudi Arabia has been notoriously doing this in a variety of different sports, but most relevant to us, WWE and now the UFC are, they're bringing events over there. And part of that is to normalize Saudi Arabia as this country that we're just all used to, and to dispel the image that they have in the West based on the horrible things that they have done, right? And unfortunately, the amount of money is so great that these people just don't seem to be able to say no, right? When WWE inked their deal with Saudi Arabia initially, it was very controversial. Even the UFC at the time would not work with Saudi Arabia because this was around the time of that horrific incident where the journalist was murdered. But due to an order from MBS, right, from the Saudi prince. And the UFC even despite all of their faults, would not touch Saudi Arabia. But WWE went right in there. The amount of money they made off of that deal was so overwhelming compared to the value of what they were providing. But Saudi Arabia wanted these big shows that Americans were used to come over and to make sure that they inserted all sorts of advertisements about how great and progressive Saudi Arabia is as a country. And they clearly succeeded, because now the UFC is going over there despite despite the fact that they were not going to do it. Even they stood their moral ground and said, we will not partner with Saudi Arabia. Well, it looks like that's changed. So the sport washing has succeeded. And this is actually a topic I want to get into on an entirely different episode, because that's a serious misappropriation of the combat sports that is happening all over the place. How it is being used as marketing by really evil governments to kind of normalize what they're doing and get in the good books of Americans. But that's a whole other conversation.
Well, you know what's happening July 4th next year, right? The UFC at the White.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is its. Do you want to talk about that? Because holy shit, that is its own thing.
Donald Trump very seriously wants to hold a UFC at the White House. 250 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 2026. John Jones immediately came out of retirement, put himself back in the drug testing pool. And so for anyone, that's extraordinary to jump back into this drug testing pool. But John Jones, you know he's serious now. Come on, right?
For John Jones to re-enter the drug testing pool, like, he's got to rearrange his whole life, man. That's a big ask for that dude.
Apparently, Chael Sonnen is going to, get off the cocaine long enough to fight again, and they're going to have big UFC. They're not even going to be selling tickets to this thing. Donald wants 25,000 fans there, or quote unquote. Well, UFC is really at this point, and that's a whole other episode too. It's just a right-wing signal. UFC. I mean, Donald Trump gets.
It's a propaganda arm of the government.
Gets entrance music to these events. Gets cheered. Their fighter who praised Adolf Hitler, he gets cheered over. I don't know, other fighters who aren't MAGA, who aren't American. UFC, really, you don't even want to tell anyone that you watch this thing. And I actually, for the most part, don't, because not only because of that. I could say it's just that that's one of the turnoffs, or a lot of turnoffs. One being, piracy is kind of a pain, and I'm not paying $80 for a pay-per-view in addition to subscribing to ESPN Plus, and their pay-per-views aren't that good anyway, right? So there are a whole lot of barriers to entry for this thing. But the biggest one is that it is a complete, not only right wing. I mean, you want to differentiate between some, I don't want to just condemn everyone who's to the right of me, especially since I'm so far left. But like, this is MAGA conservatism, if you can even call it that, quote unquote. And beyond that, it's the white supremacism, which you see with fans willing to cheer a guy who praises Adolf Hitler, and who Dana White won't even, Dana White's like, well, we don't want to punish him. He's got, and this goes back to, Steve's great episode on freedom of speech and what it means. You don't have freedom of speech, and the First Amendment in the United States Constitution only restricts state action. So, the UFC does not have to allow its fighters to say whatever they want to say. And clearly they don't, because they haven't, they didn't let a fighter, he came out however he wanted to come out. But, that when they had the flags of every nation, they excluded one, and I won't even get into that here. But so UFC next year, right? And that's sports washing.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, we're talking about the First Amendment, right? The First Amendment protects your freedom of speech in relation to government interference, not in relation to private action. And the irony is that in the States, the opposite is happening. You can get seriously penalized for speaking up against the government. But meanwhile, these Nazi fucks are allowed to just run free, and they actually get promoted and platformed because it's a money opportunity for Dana. And that is a thing that, again, I think comes from pro wrestling, just the sheer immorality of the promotion. It's not about whether it's right or wrong or ethical or not. It's about what will make the most money. And WWE is notorious for pushing. I mean, wrestling has always been like this, but WWE, probably most visibly until maybe the last 10, 15 years, they have always been notorious for pushing the envelope in terms of good taste in their storylines, because they wanted to get as much attention as possible. I mean, they would have like, like Muslim extremist terrorist angles. They would have done all sorts of absolutely crazy shit. They had a Sergeant
They
Slaughter
ruined that
defect
man's
from the
career.
United States.
They
Yeah,
ruined
yeah.
Muhammad Hassan. He was an Italian. They ruined his wrestling career.
He was
He ended up
he was an
was
Italian, for fuck's sake. And they talk about this guy a bit, because this is a really interesting
it was a
story.
great Dark Side of the Ring episode. There was an excellent episode on this man because he ended up becoming a principal in the school and doing a lot of great things. But they decided, right, I don't know if it was right after 9/11, but it was a little after 9/11 to create a character, an Arab American named Muhammad Hassan, played by this Italian, cultural appropriation that they didn't care about at all. And at first, he was actually a bit of a nuanced character. He wasn't. His take was, I haven't done anything wrong, and everyone condemns me. But ultimately, as time went on, he became more and more of, you know, a coded terrorist until they actually had some type of coded terrorist attack take place on a taped episode that just ended up being taped right before the was it a metro attack in Britain?
I think it was that horrific UK metro attack in the 2000s that
Yeah,
happened.
and
Right around that time this happened.
and they still decided to air this thing, and whatever network I think was on SmackDown was on. They're like, this guy is never Muhammad Hassan is never to be on our our station ever again. And so they killed this character on pay-per-view because he couldn't even be on TV, and he was never heard from again. But yeah, and that was part of the bad taste. And then Steve also brought up this angle that they ran in the early 90s. It was a complete failure where they had Sergeant Slaughter turn on the United States before the first Iraq war and take the side of Iraq because they thought it would result in Hulk Hogan versus Sergeant Slaughter being the biggest match of all time. They thought it was going to be they originally was supposed to be in Los Angeles in an actual stadium. And then, of course, the con, they said because they were safety issues, they had to, but there weren't safety issues. There were selling ticket issues. They ended up in a smaller arena where Hulk Hogan beat Sergeant Slaughter. And, months later, actually, Sergeant Slaughter put on a promo where he said he wants his country back. And this whole ridiculous thing where Iron Sheik, who was from Iran, he became an Iraqi, even though we know the history there. So this is professional wrestling, and this is Donald Trump. And to get back to Jesse's question, I don't know whether Donald Trump learned anything from pro wrestling, or he just had these instincts, and it matched with his character. Because wrestling over the decades just attracted a lot of these really weird types who, if they weren't wrestlers, who knows how they would have survived in life, right? So, who knows? Like Donald Trump, you can look. He says, no matter how many people are at a rally, it's a huge rally. It's the hugest rally. He's got the best words at these rallies, and that's no different from no matter what WWE does. It's a success. It's a great. And they're going to exaggerate the numbers, and if you call them on it, they're like everybody who worked there, everyone who ever has been there, and look, the numbers, they're part of the entertainment package. So, whether it's a coincidence or whether Donald Trump spending time in professional wrestling actually learned more, he just refined some of his tactics. Vince and Trump play off each other. They both learn from each other. They are one and the same, right?
Yep. And although the WWE has gotten much tamer, around, I would say, the late 2000s, they really started trying to reform their image, mostly to appeal to sponsors, and to try to not be so extreme. But they've still gone there. I mean, most recently, David, I'm sure you remember this, but back during the pandemic, WWE went through some of their worst quality television, maybe that they've ever done. Which is, to one extent, is understandable, right? Because unlike a lot of other sports, a big part of what makes pro wrestling work is the interaction with the audience. If the audience doesn't care, it's hard to get invested in this phony performance. So all of a sudden, when you have a pandemic and you're performing in an empty arena, arguably some sports like MMA can actually get better because you can actually hear these people punching the shit out of each other, right? But in WWE, if you're fighting in an empty warehouse, it just doesn't work. And so they started getting super desperate. and doing weird, crazy things. And you combine this with the fact that the person at the helm at the time, Vince McMahon, was like well into his 70s, completely insane off his rocker, even before he got old and senile. But they started doing crazy stuff. Like they would have matches where Rey Mysterio got his eye gouged out or thrown off the top of a building. They had an entire match between Bray Wyatt and John Cena, which was a fever dream. It was very bizarre. But one of the angles that really stuck out with me that is politically relevant is their Antifa angle. Do you remember that? The what the fuck did they call him? Revolution or retribution or something?
Retribution, right? They were retribution. Vince always used to play off of those. Yeah, please continue because I totally forgot.
For the benefit of the listeners, because I know nobody was watching WWE at this time, but they were starting to get really desperate and try crazy things. And, Vince's politics are very clear, being a friend of Donald Trump, but they had a whole storyline where a group of basically domestic terrorists, who were, of course, all wearing, black and all hooded. And of course, their leader was a brown man. But they would come, they were dissatisfied with the status quo and the repression they were encountering. This was just completely a shot at Black Lives Matter, right? That's all. This was during the time of the protests. So they basically had these people come out and they would like come up with chainsaws and tear the arena apart. And they'd be like, everyone to have to act like they're being terrorized by these wrestlers who are just wearing hoods and stuff. And very clearly it was a political statement. And even to this day, like as much as they try to clean up their image and make, Slim Jim and their other sponsors happy, right now they're running a cultural appropriation angle about the Gulf of America with Chad Gable, right? So they're still doing this today.
And thankfully, not so thankfully, he's injured, so they've had to kind of go in a different direction with that. But
they have another white man playing a Mexican in his role right now, and I'm not sure if that's better.
I want to bring up an angle that you will remember. I don't know if you've thought about it in a while. It's going back a few decades, but Booker T was challenging Triple H for the heavyweight championship. This is probably about 22, 23.
Fuck you, Jesse. This is your fault. This is all your fault, by the way.
And Booker T was a babyface. Triple H is the heel. I think it was a WrestleMania match, in fact. And Triple H, in the build up to this match, said specifically, Booker T, people like you don't win world championships. So at that point, I said, okay, well, here, the outcome, Booker T has to win this match. Has to win the match. It's the only outcome that you can do once you go in that direction. I don't think they should ever have gone in that direction to begin with, but once you go there, Triple H ends up winning this match, which I actually was disgusted with him for. I'm sorry. But I was disgusted with Triple H for quite a while.
It was all Jesse's fault for doing this.
I was calling him Triple K for a while after that because I think
I feel like I'm just on this episode to be the heel.
Basically,
is this true?
But
is this
what we've established, Jesse, is that's an
is
important
this episode
role.
has worked.
Everything we do is work. Fighting Matters is a work shoot, as they call it.
That's a shoot. I think Booker T was supposed to win, and I think Triple H, because he was a very political guy, and you had another angle, and this wasn't a tasteless one, but Triple H was with Stephanie at this point, and the angle was with Kurt Angle, where it looked like Kurt Angle was going to end up with Stephanie, which would have been the great outcome of this whole thing. And Triple H convinced Vince that no, a guy like Triple H does not lose the girl. And I mean, I think actually you could probably look at that as the point of no return as far as the creative descent, because that was right after the peak. Wrestling, as far as all time goes, probably peaked right before that. WrestleMania 17 in 2001. I mean, that was it. And then this angle I'm referring to with Kurt Angle and Triple H, which was pointing in one direction, and then Triple H got it nixed. And I think from that point on, ironically enough, until Vince was out and Triple H came in, that was it for WWE creatively. And that's why you see what we have today, which, and I don't know if we discussed it here, but wrestling, which, as Jeff Shaw has described as a morality play, where you used to have baby faces and heels. And the point was, you had the crowd, they would get behind the baby face, and vicariously, ultimately, the great thing about professional wrestling as a fake pseudo combat sport was that you could control the outcome. You want the guy to win. You want the babyface to win. And, let's go back to Muhammad Ali against Joe Frazier, which probably would have sold 10 million pay-per-views if they had pay-per-views in 1970, the first fight I'm talking about. Not everyone, you had white America was rooting for Joe Frazier. He didn't even understand why he represented conservative America. He's like, made no sense to him, but the whole counterculture wanted Ali to win. Ali lost that fight. You could not control the outcome. Wrestling, the morality play, the babyface can ultimately win. But today you have a situation where wrestling is audience participation. All they want to see are things happen. They want to see, you know, acrobatics in large matter, and it doesn't matter who's the babyface, who's the heel. We're gonna root for whoever's doing the most impressive. You can even call them stunts. Some people, especially old school, I enjoy modern wrestling, and I think it's super athletic. What I'd like to see is where you care about the winners and losers, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a morality play, but where you're invested emotionally, where you're not chanting "This is awesome" because they're both doing things. You want one wrestler to win and one to lose, and where
I'm
women.
glad you said you're still a fan, because it reminded me of a question that I wanted to ask. And correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding, at least historically, regardless of the politics of the leadership of professional wrestling, which is tended to be pretty right leaning, my understanding is that the audience has often been very left leaning. So my question is, why do you think that is? And B, is that still true? Are they still attracting the kind of left leaning audiences that they've had historically?
I think it's more true now than it was historic. I think
Oh,
earlier.
interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Well, I think maybe because it is something for working class people who more often might they could be socially conservative in some ways, but they're going to be more when it comes to economic, they're going to be more liberal. But if you even look back to like the lowest points of WWE and what was WWF, when you had women who were there, they weren't taken seriously. They were there just as to be objectified. The crowd that was there, they would chant for these women to take off their clothes. They would say, "Show us your puppies," meaning their breasts. And you had their announcer Jerry Lawler, you know, guys, and all these things going on, and it's just not accepted at all anymore. And I think that more than anything now is why you see UFC embraces this MAGA mentality. And even though Vince McMahon himself was so close to Donald Trump and is such a personal friend, and Linda, I mean, she's in the cabinet now, and Vince doesn't own the company, they didn't bring up Donald Trump at all because their fans were they lean more democratic at this point, and the fans would never accept. They want the women to be there as serious wrestlers. If you had someone coming there, and you have in AEW, you have some women who, but they're controlling their sexuality. It's not Tony Khan demanding that Tony Storm, play this character. This is what Tony Storm wants to do. But if they thought that anyone was being taken advantage of, and you've even seen instances with wrestling fans who tend to they could they could they could be a little much at times, and there's a rush to judgment, and they've gone after people who are likely innocent for like Me Too type situations just based on accusations that were probably untrue. So I don't know exactly what accounts for the shift, but there's been I think a shift actually from a historic situation where you probably had more meatheads and people thinking like, let's go watch people have fake fights and see women, there for titillation, to people who are there. And I can criticize these current fans because they're there, often to participate in singing songs, entrance, and I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying you have people that go to these shows and that's their main reason for being there, just to sing along for minutes on end, and or to do a thing called yeeting now, which with Jey Uso, who's become a super popular wrestler by doing this yeet thing, which I cannot even repeat. I look ridiculous doing, even though Michael Cole, who's probably older than me, does this every week on SmackDown. You can look it up,
It's an
Rob.
interactive performance, right? The
Yeah,
audience is now there to
yeah.
participate.
And they're not there to root for wrestlers to win or lose, and they're there to. And you even saw back in even 20 years ago, if a wrestler made a mistake, the crowd would chant, "You, we curse here, you fucked up, you
Oh
fucked."
yeah.
They don't do that. There's no more "you fucked up" chants. They're very charitable to the wrestlers. And in a lot of ways, it's great to see. The only thing I would really like to see is, I think, wrestling itself as a form of entertainment, the value is most when you care about who's winning and who's losing. And I have a hard time, and it's not because and part of it's because if you see a movie, the movie, unless it's a documentary, a movie's not. When people say, how do you watch that? It's not real. Like, well, you watch movies, you read books, right? And you get into these characters. A movie can make me cry. I saw Nora. I was weeping at the end of a Nora. And the only thing is, you don't have a Nora halfway through breaking and be like, you're watching a movie. She's not a stripper. Come on, this is a woman who would never actually. They don't do that in wrestling. They feel like, and they're doing it less now. But Vince has this weird thing where it's like, don't want the fans to think they're dumb, or I don't. So but you would never break into a movie. I'm not going to see this movie because it's not my thing. But you're not going to see Superman and be like, he's not really flying during the movie, right? Like, after the movie, you may have an interview with, but during the movie, you're like, he's not really flying, right? Like, they're friends. These actors, they don't really hate it. That's not Lex Luthor. These guys are best friends, and they do that on wrestling programs, and it makes no sense to me.
It's interesting how the sport has evolved, and especially politically, as you guys said, because the one difference between WWE and one thing that is very schizophrenic and hard to understand is very clearly the company. I mean, Vince McMahon had been at the head of that company for so long. I mean, a very, very close friend of Donald Trump. Again, like you said, his wife is the Secretary of Education. And God, you could get into, like, you want to talk about relationship dynamics, the Vince and Linda yeah, like the Vince Linda McMahon thing is very similar in a lot of ways to the like Donald Melania Trump thing, where it's like a fake the relationship itself is kayfabed, right? They're not even in a real marriage,
right? For like a decade or longer.
Yeah, it's a completely like it's like living in a completely fictional world. Everything is fictional. It's part of a performance, and that's what makes it so hard for wrestling reporters to actually find out what the fuck is really going on, because you're dealing with like the world's best liars. These people, their entire life is to put on a lie. I mean, probably the best example is the Undertaker, who just finally, after years, kind of started acting like a real human being. And he's talking about how, for like 30 years, he felt like he can't even go in public without having like the face paint and the hat and everything.
Dave, let him start acting like a dead man again and just shut the hell up. I'd much prefer that, actually, from learning about the human Undertaker. Don't tread on me.
Yeah. But it's a really weird aspect of the company, how the leadership and the wrestlers all generally are quite far to the right. But the fans are very far to the left. And it's a very different dynamic from, say, the UFC, which the UFC, they have very deliberately made their product poisonous to progressives. Whereas WWE has gone the opposite route, despite the fact that that isn't the belief system they necessarily carry. They have very publicly supported Pride and LGBTQ initiatives. And like you said, or especially in the last 10, 15 years, they've really leaned into, the women's wrestling side of things, which before, like you said, used to be basically a TNA show. They've really tried to clean up and cater to progressives. And every once in a while, when they veer off the path, like when they have Hulk Hogan come by, who's, basically part of the MAGA movement, they have him come by and he gets just gets booed to shit because the audience is very left wing. They'll learn from that and they won't bring him back again, even though he's a big part of their history. So it's weird, these divergent paths where the UFC has basically said, we don't care about progressive fans. We are a mega propaganda outlet, but the WWE has taken this totally different path, and they're owned by the same company, which is wild.
And they both seem to be succeeding, right? Wildly succeeding. Wildly succeeding, actually.
And maybe that's an example of kayfabe in action, right? Maybe we're being kayfabed right now, and they're capturing the left and the right in different buckets. Sort of like, I mean, the example that I give, if you mentioned earlier that politics is all kayfabe, and kayfabe, I think we just defined this earlier on the show, but kayfabe basically means like it's a fake performance. It's wrestling terminology that is probably, it's bled far further beyond that. I was listening to an Ezra Klein interview the other day where the guest talked about how politicians are kayfabing each other. So this language,
I think it's a Merriam-Webster. I think it's a Merriam-Webster now. Maybe I'm misremembering. I don't want to. I know this is I don't want to go on the record and be wrong about something like that, but I do believe it's Merriam-Webster
Oh,
legitimate.
we go on the record about lots of things that people think we're wrong about, so it's totally
The
fine.
example that I would give is this recent big beautiful bill vote where like all of the Republicans put up this performative resistance, but then they all ultimately caved because they wanted to be on record saying things that would be popular with their constituents, even if they avoided them. And then you got this weird shit about how like Susan Collins votes no, but Lisa Murkowski votes yes, even though they both hate it. Well, coincidentally, one of those two is very much at risk of losing her seat in the next election, and that's Susan Collins. So you got to wonder, was there some sort of backroom agreement where it's like, okay, well, you have to vote no because otherwise you'll lose your seat. Lisa Murkowski, you're in a safe seat, so you can vote yes even though you hate this. And so I've heard many political commentators wonder, like, are we all being kayfabed here? Where these people are putting on performative outrage for the purpose of satisfying their constituents, even when they're deliberately knifing them in the back 5 minutes later. And I think the answer is probably yes. That's probably exactly what's happening.
I think politics is more of a work than wrestling is. I think you have more chance of a shoot breaking out in professional wrestling than you do in the political arena, unless Donald Trump's involved. Donald Trump's the wild card where actually it could become a shoot because you just don't know what this guy's going to do, which is also professional wrestling at its root. It's a sort of wild man type of business as well.
And that's a very Vince McMahon thing as well, where Vince for a long time was the wild card in his company. It's like, who knows what Vince is going to do? Is he going to start a fight with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia? I don't know. He might. We're just going to have to roll with the punches.
That's another story we can talk about when he did start a fight with the Crown Prince and the wrestlers were held hostage in Saudi Arabia. This is another story that happened. And they had to settle a suit so it wouldn't go into discoveries because they denied that this happened. Officially, they denied that it ever happened, but it happened. Yes, the wrestlers were held hostage in Saudi Arabia. Their families were frightened, and a lot of them said they'd never go back, but I think they've all gone back and then some. Some new ones have gone back, have since gone that weren't there at that point.
Yep. Some people that you would think would never go. You mentioned CM Punk, right? Some people that you would think would never go. Well, they've gone now.
Very interesting story right now. That whole and I got asked about CM Punk by a student at High Style who doesn't really pay attention to wrestling, does pay attention to politics, pays attention to the Middle East, and he said, "Is CM Punk back?" Because he saw the whole apology, and I said, "Oh, you're going to be sorry you asked that question." I proceeded to tell him the whole story.
So this is actually very politically relevant. Why don't you tell that story about what happened with CM Punk, why, where his politics are, and the relationship with Saudi Arabia, and why this latest angle with John Cena was so crazy? Because this is actually very political.
It's so political. So it goes back to WWE's relationship with Saudi Arabia, which began before the Khashoggi incident. And this show was labeled Blood Money. And I think the person is a friend of mine who gave it a label, a personal friend, Todd Martin. I think he was the first one to ever call it Blood Money, which just took over. And CM Punk at this point in time wrestled at WWE's competition. They're the number two. It's hard to call this number two, but they were more competition at that point when they had CM Punk. He was a big star, and he was at AEW, and he put up a tweet where he attacked the Miz for going to Saudi Arabia, and I think the tweet said something like "Go suck on some of that Saudi blood money dick" or something to words to that effect. And then should we get into?
We don't need to get into brawl out. We can skip past that. But basically, he left the company.
He's starting fights. CM Punk. I'm sure the people that CM Punk was getting into arguments with, he wasn't wrong probably for being annoyed by these. He was wrong for getting into fights with them as a 40-year-old man at this point in time. He couldn't just let anything go. They end up having, even though Tony Khan was such a fan of CM Punk that when CM Punk returned from injury after his first fight, it was reported by Wade Keller that as CM Punk returned, Tony Khan was in the back in the gorilla position, and he was chanting CM Punk with his hands in the air, the owner of the company. He ended up having to fire CM Punk. And then CM Punk ends up signing with WWE. And he's been there now for 2 years, and they've had Saudi Arabia shows he didn't go to, and all of a sudden they have this one upcoming called Night of Champions, and and out of nowhere, CM Punk. I shouldn't even say out of nowhere. He's been built for a title shot. If you look at wrestling logically, which perhaps you shouldn't these days, but CM Punk's been winning matches, and he's been built to the point where he deserves a title chance, a world title chance. So it just so happens that WWE has a show in Saudi Arabia, and it doesn't have to. You could book things however you want in wrestling. You don't have to book CM Punk for a title shot in Saudi Arabia. But CM Punk comes out to challenge John Cena, who, believe it or not, is back now as a heel, and he's the champion. And he shouldn't be wrestling at all at this point. But Punk is there to challenge Cena, and Cena says, "You know what, hero?" And you're like, "Hero?" And there's these loaded phrases throughout. Yeah, you can get a title shot at Night of Champions, and he didn't even say Saudi Arabia at this point, but everyone knows it's in Saudi Arabia. And CM Punk, and this is just storyline, but like CM Punk's like, I got to get the world championship, so I'm going to go to Saudi Arabia and go back on CM Punk. He's actually very, very progressive, very left wing. He's gone on TV with pro-choice shirts. He's gone out in Palestinian colors, and
He's attended protests. Like if you follow his social, like all of these protests that are going on right now, he's there.
So all of a sudden you have this set up and you're like, okay, he's going to Saudi Arabia. But not only that, then they have an angle take place a few weeks before the show where John Cena puts CM Punk through a table. And you have to understand, okay, audience these days, they love furniture. No matter what they're chanting.
They're like JD Vance in that way. They're big fans of furniture. You put someone through a table and they're so
no matter
happy.
what point you have it, you can have a match that's like one of the greatest matches of all time. You'll hear, "We want tables." It's often for no reason at all, except that's what they want to see. But you get a table spot and wrestlers recover usually pretty quickly. CM Punk's put through this table and he has to lie there unconscious for 10 minutes of John Cena just degrading him in a way that's not meant to promote the match, but meant to humiliate CM Punk in a way he can't respond to, because they're going to Saudi Arabia. CM Punk can't come back and say anything really politically. And, Cena's talking about what a hypocrite he is.
And that's wild when you think about it. Like it would be one thing if you bring back one of your performers and you say, like, look, we know that you're really progressive and we know that in the past you've publicly spoken out about this, but we really need you at the show. Let's just not mention it. And let's just like get you on there and not make a big deal out of it. It'll just be a thing. But they made a whole storyline about how CM Punk was selling out his morals by going to Saudi Arabia. Like they basically,
as a babyface, this is not how you promote professional wrestling. You're undercutting.
Yeah.
And not only is he a babyface, he's a very popular babyface. This is cutting your nose to spite your face. But continue. I'm sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, and then once he got there, they made him publicly on air apologize to the fans of Saudi Arabia for a tweet that he made like 10 years ago, and that just really goes to show kind of in a lot of ways the sort of, I don't even know what the word would be, but there's a few things going on. One is just the punitive nature, the pettiness of WWE as an employer. And again, that is a direct parallel to Trump, right? Who's like the pettiest person you can imagine. But then on top of that, just the depravity of like, why would you draw attention to this from a business perspective? Like, you're going to a place that decapitated and butchered a journalist. Why would you turn this into entertainment at the risk of one of your own talent's expenses? But this just happened a few weeks ago. And this is even today when WWE is very sanitized compared to how they used to be, they still kind of get into this. But I guess that leads to one more thing I want to ask you about, David. And, we've touched on some of the nomenclature here in wrestling. We talked about, kayfabing, but really the one thing that everyone knows about wrestling is you got to have a good guy and a bad guy, right? Or in wrestling terminology, you have the good guy's a babyface, the bad guy's a heel. Yeah. And this is something that Donald Trump understands at an instinctual level. He always has a heel, even when it doesn't make sense. He was complaining about Hillary Clinton 8 years after defeating her. He's still complaining about Joe Biden. But at least in those cases, those were legitimate rivals of his. So I mean, it's not good. I don't think it's moral or ethical politics to be that combative. I much prefer, you go back and you look at like the Romney Obama debates or the Romney McCain debates where they're actually being civilized adults. I would much prefer that. But I mean, we can at least acknowledge that Donald Trump is legitimately rivals with Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. What is crazy to me is when he kayfabes it and he manufactures a rival and his base still falls for it. The example that always comes to mind for me is his villainization of Anthony Fauci, who was his like part of his government, right? He was the one overseeing what that man did, and that man did nothing wrong. He did nothing but try to help the people of America. However, a very broad, mostly right-wing anti-vax movement decided that they hated Anthony Fauci. And so Trump turned him heel. And to this day, Trump will talk about the villain is anti-Fauci and look at all of the bad things that this guy did. It's like, first of all, this guy didn't do anything bad. He just was doing his job. And second, he was part of your government. Like, he was your employee effectively. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but that was
not according to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that was part of his team. And so that is the wild thing is he will turn people heel even when it logically doesn't make sense. Like, this person is part of your crew and now you've pounced on them and made them the bad guy to preserve yourself so you can stay the baby face. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because that is a very pro wrestling thing that is really, I think, pulling the wool over a lot of people's eyes. They seem to fall victim to it so much when they see Trump do this.
It's such a pro wrestling thing, but then I think it also comes back to, does it go beyond Trump, beyond pro wrestling? If we look culturally at the United States, doesn't the United States always need a heel? Don't we had the Cold War where the Soviet Union, Russia was the heel. We received all sorts of propaganda about and Russia had its own issues, but obviously the United States did, and the United States really has issues now. But then we went from a period of relative calm, and all of a sudden, Al Qaeda and all these other issues. We always seem to create enemies. We always need an enemy. We're the baby face. And I'm looking at it from a United States perspective, but that's probably true throughout every country. Probably does the same thing. So I'm wondering, whether it's so much professional wrestling or whether does life imitate professional wrestling? Does professional wrestling imitate life? And is Donald Trump just the id, just an exaggerated, Donald Trump, it's like a funhouse mirror. Like, he's a reflection of us all. Like, I think we're all completely not, Steve, you're a Canadian, like, to me, I'm like, we're all complicit in this man. I think the Democrats are super complicit. I cannot believe, you want to talk professional wrestling. Look at the blundering 2016 to lose an election, an entirely winnable election, to send Hillary Clinton out there and to then pretend, with the Democrats, it's, it's the work, the Democrats can never fail the people. The people can only fail the Democrats. They run perfect candidates. You had this cover up with Joe Biden, and now the issue is, Jake Tapper's gone out. Is it Jack Tapper? Jake Tapper gone out there. It's a great book, actually. Original Sin. His sin is writing this book, which is how we ended up with Donald Trump in there. Donald Trump should never have won these elections. The Democrats gave it to him. The Democrats brought him back from the dead. The only reason Joe Biden won in 2020 was because of COVID. COVID was the best thing that ever happened to Democrats, because then Joe Biden hid away and Donald Trump still almost won that election, right? Then Donald Trump is gone. And then they're like, well, we'd rather run against Donald Trump. This is what they're thinking. So, they indict him and the first indictment was for signing checks to an adult film actress. I got to tell you,
that sounds so small time now compared to what we're talking about, right?
And people rallied around him because they're like, this is a political witch hunt. And I got to tell you, like, when you're indicting him for that, you can indict a lot of politicians for signing checks. Maybe it's not the tabloid, maybe they're not signing checks to an adult film actress, but they're signing checks and you can indict them for it. So, Donald Trump, we apparently want him, right? Like, I don't think I do, but I'm complicit in it too. I try not to be. Throughout his first term, I was like, you're just giving this guy oxygen talking about every tweet. I was like, who cares what he's tweeting? Who cares what he's saying, right? Like, look at what he does. Everyone always cares about what he's saying. Look at what Donald Trump says. You got to always look at what this man is doing, and then they just breathe new life into this guy. Like, from Friday the 13th or Halloween, as Jason Michael Myers returns from the dead. He was gone. He was gone. And even though, but again, I come back to he's the symptom, he is not the disease. So even though he was gone, it doesn't matter. Actually, I've also warned that Donald Trump, you're going to get someone who's, smarter, and, more intelligent, more calculating Donald Trump in the future. So even if Donald Trump is gone, like, that's not the end of this. But Donald Trump has professional wrestling as idiocracy. It's just it's an extraordinary thing to actually witness, right, over the last 10 years. It's like someone's playing a joke on us. I've engaged in psychedelics, and I'm wondering if, like, I never came back.
I've heard people theorize that maybe we all died during the pandemic, and this is just some sort of weird hell we're living through.
Some type of hallucination.
Well, I'm so glad you did this, David. Thanks so much for coming by.
Good. People like it, and I love talking and stuff, and I'm so glad.
Yeah,
I feel like I think this is the first time we've ever spoken, but I'm so familiar with your voice, and I hear you all the time.
I hear that a lot.
Yeah. But I
Awesome.
I hope this was a good thing. I enjoy doing it, for sure.
Well, I think if nothing else, it gives people an idea of where Trump comes from and why he does the things he does. Because I think way too many people look at him and try to figure out, like, what is his political motivation? Where does he fit on the spectrum? And I think if you look at him more as a carny, like as a pro wrestling promoter, all of a sudden his behaviors make way more sense than if you try to look at him as a politician.
I want to be loved. I want to be loved by the people. He always wants to be loved. That's why that's why he sells these ceasefires that aren't ceasefires. Like, look what I did here. I've got this deal. I've got this. He's the deal maker, and that's at the heart of it. Yeah, I don't think there's an ideological center at Donald Trump at all. I don't think he believes in. I think he'll say anything, and that is professional wrestling at the heart of it. This was awesome.
Amazing, man. Well, thanks, and thanks, Jesse, as well. This is a good one.
Hey, Jesse, you
Triple J out.
He's drink the water and spit.
He's got to go book this weekend show. He's a very busy man.
Three shows. Well, Shawn Michaels has the NXT one. So.
Busy weekend.
It is a busy weekend for wrestling.
Awesome. Well, I will let you guys go. Thanks a lot, all. This is fun. Take care.
Bye.